Hello and welcome to iBluairjgr Gaming for Comedy. Today we're going to talk about the Stalker tank, specifically a build I like to call Lifesteal. The name is very creative. Let's get into it. Like all tanking builds, the idea is to find a comfortable balance between threat generation, defense, and sustainability. This build is a little bit lacking in the defense mitigation department, but it makes up for that deficit with superior health sustain and some pretty solid threat generation, tiny bit of group utility, and that's always nice to bring to the table. Let's check out what it can do, what skills are on the list, you know what I'm saying? Coming up first is something that might feel a little bit familiar to you. It's Whiplash. This is the tank version of Shred. It deals low damage, it has no suit power cost. It's basically a filler attack. What makes it different from the Assault version is it generates 125% threat. That is very important to tanking. Next we have Nano Field. This is the meat and cheese for this build. It's a 2-press ability. The first press activates the field, enemies in the radius take damage, and you're healed based on a percentage of that damage. The second press collapses the field to deal more damage and heal you based on a percentage of that damage. Whew, it's a mouthful. Taking the third spot is Nanovirus. This ability deals moderate damage to 3 targets in front of you and applies 10 marks to those targets. Each time that target takes damage from any source, a mark is consumed, and they take even more damage, so yeah, it's really good. Fourth in order, not stature, is Decimate. It's a fairly straightforward ability. After deflecting attack, you can activate it to deal damage to 5 enemies around your character. After it's activated, it reduces the damage you take by a percentage. At tier 4, this ability generates 20 suit power. Tier 8 grants you an empower, increases your support power 20%. Beef. And next, you know it, you love it, it's Punish. This ability is only usable after landing a critical hit. If it's used below 35 suit power, it regenerates 30 suit power. And I gotta tell you, suit power, it's I don't know what I'd do without it. Coming up next, we have our first utility ability, Preparation. It's a channeled ability. While channeling, you regenerate suit power. At tier 4, you also regenerate health. At the end of that channel, you get a boost to critical hit rate and deflect chance. We're almost done here, people. Next from the utility section is Stagger. This is a stun ability and an interrupt. It's just mandatory for every build in Wildstar. Tanks, healers, DPS, get those interrupts ready. If you don't, you're just not gonna have fun if you don't have an interrupt on your bar, because you're gonna die a lot. Last but certainly not least is Bloodthirst. On activation, it grants you and all your nearby party members a small empower for their damage, and it grants you a big boost to your lifesteal. When you pair that with Nano Field, it makes you unstoppable. Well, okay, you're not completely invincible, but you can heal yourself a lot when you pair these abilities together. It's impressive. I wouldn't leave home without it. I mean, you can, but... Okay, now it's time to see what this build can really do. We're going to take it into the veteran Malgrave Trail, and we're going to test it out. But before we start talking about the skills and how they're being used and what's really going on behind the scenes, you know, what buttons I'm pressing, we're going to talk about the threat meter. In the top left-hand corner of my screen, you will notice that there is a threat meter, and it is very useful for tanking. It's very useful for DPS to know if your tank is having trouble holding threat, and if you need to slow down on DPS, stop DPS slowly. You know, the threat management is not only the responsibility of the tank, it is also the responsibility of the DPS. If you're doing too much damage, it is also your responsibility to slow down on that damage so that the tank can generate some threat back, so you don't take the threat and the boss will start beating you up, and it just turns into a big... Before we talk about any of the pros to this build, we're going to talk about some of the cons. It does not have a taunt, and that can be a big con in any sort of dungeon or adventure, any sort of group content where things are happening quickly and randomly. Reason why this build, it's difficult to generate threat. if you don't have the monster or the mob attacking you. Why? Because you lose out on some precious suit power regeneration from Decimate. Suit power is very necessary to threat generation with this build. If you run out, if you manage it poorly, you're gonna have a hard time keeping that threat. You have to make sure you're landing those punishes on time. You're landing those decimates whenever it comes off cooldown. You're putting up that nano field for those marks and you're consuming them. You're doing all this stuff, and it's all to manage your suit power, which in turn manages your threat. Boom. So on the flip side to that coin, when you do manage your suit power correctly with all the punishes and decimates and blah 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 blah, you get a nice healthy threat lead on your allies, and you can kind of sit back and go get some coffee or whatever. Well, that's not really true, because you kind of have to sustain yourself, because that's the purpose of this build, is sustain. You have to actively press that nano field button. You have to actively use preparation when your health is getting low, when your suit power is getting low. It's all about the sustain, and the sustain is really good. You see, when Bloodthirst is active, when you have a lot of suit power for nano field, your health is not going to go down that fast. Now, you're not invincible, as I would certainly like to be, but I mean, you can hold your own against some giant bumblebee things and a dirty humanoid guy with claws for a pretty long time. And that's pretty much the build in a nutshell. It's got great health sustain, pretty good threat generation when you do it right, and it's fun to play. If you like precise button spamming, then this is definitely the build for you. It works, it's fun to play. It's definitely not the best, but you don't really need to be the best to have a good time in Wildstar. I mean, sure, if you're raiding, you want to go for the top spec, but you know, just calm down and have some fun, because Wildstar is very fun, and you should play it. They don't pay me to say that stuff. They should, but they don't. But anyway, this has been another skill build. iBluairJgR game for comedy. I know it's still not like that funny. I know, but we're working on it. You know, we're trying to find that formula. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't rise to the top in a day. Nobody got to the top of Mount Everest in a day. I mean, unless they took a helicopter. Well, I don't think helicopters can fly up that high, because I don't. Well, actually, I don't know, because I'm not like aeronautical.